Ruslan.
Recently, Joe Rogan had Dr. Stephen C. Meyer on his podcast, and in this part of the conversation, he kind of presses him fairly hard about the existence of God, tying the belief of Christians into the fake belief that some folks who are in cults have, and much more. Okay. If you haven't seen this podcast, this is a fantastic conversation. There's a whole lot here. I'm doing a multi-part series. I don't know if Rogan has ever had someone who is this articulate, this solid in the faith, and this scientific to kind of glue all these worlds together. So today we're going to be looking at the hour and 35-minute mark. We're going to be looking for, at about 5 or 6 minutes of footage, and there's a whole lot here. So let's jump right in.
I understand, but you're a young, impressionable person looking for guidance, and your life is not so good before this. You're not so good
at all. Not so good
happy.
At all.
So this is the part where Joe Rogan is asking him about his personal conversion story and why he believes in God. And he is trying to reduce it to more of a psychological phenomenon. You were young, you were impressionable, and this is why you may have chose to believe this stuff, not whether or not this is true, specifically about being a Christian.
Then you find something that gives you meaning and gives you focus and gives you this beautiful philosophy to change the way you think, and you adopt it wholeheartedly.
I appreciate Joe Rogan here calling Christianity a beautiful philosophy. We're going to come back to that. And again, stay till the very end, because Joe Rogan reveals some pretty alarming things about a cult that he's indirectly connected with, kind of. Okay, so just make sure you watch till the very end.
Young people are inclined to do, or like anybody that's looking for change in their life, anybody that's looking for something better is inclined to do. It's a natural pattern of growth. It's a natural pattern of recognizing there's a better way, and you seek out that way.
Sure. I mean, that'd be an alternative explanation. I experienced it in a way that convinced me that something more than myself and my thinking was responsible.
Isn't it beneficial to think that way, though? It's beneficial in adopting that philosophy to think that way. And if you think that way, you're rewarded, and you are inside of this philosophy that does have these beautiful tenets to it, that does have these beautiful ideas.
What is really interesting is that Stephen C. Meyer does this beautiful articulation of Christianity. And he said Christianity is the overlap of an objective reality with a subjective experience. And so he's trying to unpack this subjective experience, and Joe Rogan kind of keeps pressing him more and more here. But again, this takes a very interesting turn. So make sure you keep watching.
Sure. I mean, I would not place any weight on my experience in trying to persuade someone else of the truth of theism or Christianity.
Right.
I have a lot of other arguments that I would place weight on, because I think we all have internal experiences. But this was such a dramatic thing, and persistent concern for a given friend that I am aware is hurting. Not what is in my natural my natural inclinations towards selfishness are still very much in evidence.
So he points out that the change in his view of life was not natural, meaning that in his natural state, he's still very selfish. He's still consumed about whatever his agenda is. And he's saying all of a sudden when he became a Christian that there's something supernatural that happened. Okay. This is what the scriptures calls being born again. Philippians talks about how we get new desires to obey God and love people and so on and so forth, right? So he's talking about the born again experience, and Rogan kind of keeps pushing him on this
every day, right?
But isn't that a part of the human survival mechanism? I mean, there's a lot of natural inclinations that people have towards selfishness if they're not treated correctly when they're young, or if
this is how materialists would argue is, well, it's in our best interest to be selfish, right?
They encounter bad experiences. And then when you encounter good experiences, and now you can relax and you can be a part of something that's bigger and better.
Yeah, don't know. I mean, I'm prompted to pray for someone, then learn later that person is experiencing some extreme difficulty. Don't know why I suddenly felt that. I mean,
you care about them.
I care about them, but I didn't know that they were. In any case, I think
Rogan is missing the reality that it is not in our natural state to care about people in the degrees that we do as Christians. It is not in our natural state for people to care for less fortunate people. Charity is not something that we naturally have. It is against our own interest to care for the least of these, the way Jesus instructs us to.
I think this could be somewhat unproductive, because I'm completely willing to concede your point that
it's definitely not unproductive. It's interesting.
Well, good. I just mean in the sense that I don't think that I could persuade you to be a theist or a Christian on the basis of my personal experience. I would concede that,
Because it's not about just personal experience. He's having an objective scientific conversation. The whole conversation up to this point was objective scientific. Rogan asks him, well, what is your faith? What is your religion? He says, I'm a Christian. And that's how they kind of get into this aspect of it.
Because there's always...
Well, I'm not asking you to do that, though.
Or anyone else.
I'm asking to find the underpinnings of yours.
Yeah.
I want to find your origin story, right? So that's
I
it.
love that.
So I'm trying to figure out like what, and I could see why
It's a little dicey here. It's becoming unproductive.
adopting that thought would be very comforting, and I could see why adopting that. I mean, that happens in cults. Like this is like
Okay, now he's going to get into a crazy story about his connection with the cult here. Okay, but before we do that, I got to show you something kind of crazy. Over 50% of the people who watch this channel are not subscribed. And out of the people that are subscribed, less than 10% actually have their bell notification on. So do me a solid. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure the bell notification is turned on so you don't miss anything we got going here. All right? Peace. And be sure to smash the like button while you're at it. And I got to let you know about something we just announced. August 26th in Oceanside, California, which is North County, San Diego. We're doing our first live podcast event happening. Early bird tickets are on sale through August 1st. So be sure to scoop up your tickets featuring myself, Ray Rock, John Keith, and God Logic Apologetics. Okay, so be sure to pull up to the event August 26th. Let's get back to this Joe Rogan clip.
I bought a building that I was going to convert to a comedy club, and it was owned by a cult before I had it. And this cult, there's a documentary on it. It's called Holy Hell, and the cult, it was called the Buddha Field. They existed in West Hollywood, and they made their way out to Austin. And the guy who ran it was a very charismatic guy who was also a hypnotherapist and a gay porn star.
That turned into darkness really quick. All right. So they're talking about this man's subjective experience with Christianity. And Rogan's like, oh, you know what? I bought a building off of a cult leader who was a corn star and did some crazy stuff to people. Like the way these conversations go on the Rogan podcast are incredible.
And this guy had these people convinced that they had extreme meaning being with him, and it meant so much to them that they were willing to sacrifice the rest of their lives, and they were going to travel with him no matter where he went. And he would do these things to them where we'd have them, and he would impart upon him what he called the knowing. And it was a very difficult thing to get. He had to choose you for it, and people waited years. But when they did have that experience, it was one of the most overwhelming things they'd ever experienced in their life. It was like a days-long psychedelic experience where there was no drugs involved. It was merely him with this ritual, this thing that he would do. He's put his hands on their head, and there's videos of these people, like in orgasmic ecstasy, experiencing love and God in a way that they had never before. This was real to them, but it was a cult. It was a guy who was a scam artist, who was a con man, who was a hypnotist, and knew how to manipulate people. And ultimately, the result was terrible.
Right.
These people lost 20 plus years of their lives, and
probably a lot of money in the process.
And so, but they believed that because of that personal experience, because they were guided. They did not have a good life. They were not happy. Now all of a sudden they found purpose.
Right.
So Rogan has this presupposition that just because someone sincerely believes something, that therefore other people who sincerely believe something that may be true are invalidated. That sincere belief isn't enough, which I would agree with. You could be sincerely wrong, right? And I wish that Stephen pushed back a little harder on this point, because he makes a really, really, really good point here in a moment.
Right. They were part of this group, and there was this guy, and he had the answers to everything. He's this deity type figure, and he said that he was God, and they were all God, and it was all this beautiful experience, but it wasn't. It was manipulative. It was him figuring out a way to hijack the human brain.
Manipulate their emotions.
And that there's things in the human brain where you can convince the human brain that it's having an experience whether it has it or not. That's what hypnotism is all about.
He's really intense in this. Look at the body language here. This is some intense, I'm like, okay. I believe you, Joe.
If you're a young person and you're looking for some meaning to life, you can work yourself into a frenzy where you believe you have this experience with God.
Yeah, well, a couple things to say about that. One is that I think it's one of the beautiful things about Christianity is that there is an interplay between the subjective experience of the individual believer and the objective witness of God's actions in time, space, and history, and that that people are enjoined to check their experience against objective criteria, so that
Yes.
and
That's a gem, man. That's so good.
I think Jesus famously said, "You will know you will know the tree by its fruit."
Now here is such a brilliant point, and I wish he would have pounded on this more. You will know a tree by its fruit. What does that mean? That means if you look at the trajectory of my life before Christ and after Christ, if you look at the transformation that happened in my heart, even with all of the things that Rogan is talking about. Oh, you had a troubled childhood, you were impressionable, you were young, yada, yada. Of course you would believe something like this. Of course you would be religious, right? You were primed for it. But the difference with Christianity is, generally speaking, people who follow Jesus have, one, an encounter with the objective reality of the resurrection, which they talk about later in this interview, okay, and the implications of that. But two, are living a more virtuous life. They are different than they were before. They have different desires. My life apart from Christ is totally different than my life with Christ. Now, you could say that, well, what if that was just a psychological phenomenon? Okay, what if it was? However, the reality is that everything about my life is substantially better, and I would assume that he would co-sign this, than it was before being a Christian in every measurable metric that we would acknowledge as virtue, which by the way, the world just borrows from God anyway. So I wish he would have pointed that out a bit more. Jesus said, you will know a tree by its fruit. Bad fruit, bad root. And so if we're seeing people who are being transformed by the power of the gospel and the trajectory of their lives is totally different, I think there's something to that when you factor it in, that there's an objective reality to the resurrection, into intelligent design and the fine-tuning of the universe and all these other things that they talked about.
In the case of the cult, it had a horrible outcome.
Right.
But not for the
time.
first few years.
No.
Yeah, not for the first few years. And then the rest of it was awful. That's the point. The rest of it was terrible.
They were having a good time.
Yeah, so I think these things do have.
So it's like because they had a good time for the first couple years. That is somehow comparable to someone like myself who's had a completely transformed life 20 plus years later, walking with Jesus, loving my wife, leading a family, doing substantially better, having had treatment for my mental health, all of these different things that makes my life completely different, that I could point to thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians that could testify to the same thing.
Have to be tested over time. In my own experience, because I tended to overthink things, because I was annoyed at Christians who talked about their personal experience without being able to explain to me in any kind of on any kind of objective basis why I should consider their faith.
There you have it. Christian says he was annoyed with other Christians on the Joe Rogan podcast. Why is he annoyed? Because Christians could only articulate what was happening to them in a personal sense, in a subjective sense, not in an objective reality, tying it into history, science, so on and so forth.
I tended to be very either distrustful or skeptical about subjective experience, or overthinking in a way that would almost crowd the possibility of such experiences out. So I didn't really have many of them. As a young convert, I didn't have a lot of that. These things sort of crept up on me over the years, and I have become more confident that in some cases, in addition to the sort of general guidance of Christianity as a religious philosophy, there have been occasions in my life where I've experienced what I thought were pretty clear instances of specific guidance towards specific courses of action or choices I needed to make.
I can tell you that the first time I sat down with my wife and we had a real conversation, in that moment, it wasn't an audible voice, it wasn't an external audible voice, but there was something in my spirit. I had been in the faith for a few years that said, this is your wife. Maybe that was my subconscious, maybe that was my just a thought, but there was something there. And now 19 years later, we're married, we have 2 kids, we live an amazing life, we serve in our church, all these different things. And so there are a couple of fork in the road moments like that where I believe the Spirit of God led me into what he wanted for my life. And I think there are other Christians that could testify to that. Now, the beautiful part about this is my faith has only increased with time. The more I've engaged in the philosophical conversations, the religious conversations, the scientific conversations, my faith has only increased with time.
And again, I wouldn't put any weight on that for anyone else, but it has been part of my experience in that sense.
Well, I could say the same about my own life.
Of course you could. Of course you could.
I've have many, many moments where I felt like I was guided. Many moments.
Cool. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean,
Cool.
I mean, that's why I didn't mean that as a critique of our conversation to say I don't think it's productive. I just say, I mean that in a philosophical sense, that if you want to talk across a worldview divide and say, hey, here's my philosophy, here's my worldview, here, and you have a different worldview, if we want to have that great conversation, either one of us just appealing to our personal experience is not going to move the discussion towards greater understanding.
But you're assuming I have a different worldview.
Yo, Joe Rogan wants to be with the in crowd so bad. He's like, but you're assuming I'm... Joe, just come to church, bro. Just come to church, man. Just come to church, read the Bible, right? I think you'd be shocked on how real all of it really is, right? So like, you're assuming I have a different worldview. Well, I think as this conversation goes on, you'll definitely notice that Joe has a different worldview in terms of how much, and maybe he's just being a good interview and pushing back. But Zach, you had something interesting to say. You said if they were talking about a trip on psychedelics, that he would not be pushing back as hard.
Yeah, I was like, if this is DMT, if he was like, man, I heard from God, not an audible voice, but definitely something pushing me while I was tripping on DMT, Joe Rogan would be like, wow, same. Yeah, that's documented forever. There must be some sort of higher power deep within our conscious that we're maybe accessing another dimension. But then when it's through the Bible, it's like, no, there's no way there's another higher power and another dimension that we can speak to. But with DMT, oh, for sure. But when it's Christianity, it's like, it's probably just your subconscious, right? Your preconceived.
It reminds me of a cult that I
It sounds like a cult.
Well, I'm not assuming that. I'm just saying that in general.
I'm interested in your experiences. I just want to know how thoroughly you've thought them through.
Yeah. Well, I tend to overthink things, but
right.
Yeah. But
with a particular goal in mind, perhaps.
Yeah, I want to know the truth. You know.
I tend to overthink things with a particular goal. Yeah, the truth. Yep, the truth. I love this conversation, man. And I love, again, big props to Joe Rogan for having more Christians on this channel, on his podcast, leaning into these hard conversations, all of these different things. We're going to be looking at more of the clips from this conversation. And if you want to check those out, meet us at the after party. If you don't know, the after party is available daily on our Patreon community, where you can get the replays of those completely every single day. And so meet us over there. We'll be doing more reactions from this. They get into the resurrection of Jesus. There's a whole lot here that I cannot wait to get into. All right, so I'll see you guys over there. Peace.